Hey guys, I actually just got the idea. I was gonna make a video about explaining like how I normally stat and stuff like that in D3, or how I decide how to help people who ask me for help. But I'm gonna make a small video series that kind of goes a little bit more in depth into the individual. I'll pretty much go off this list, the individual offensive things on Diablo 3, and kind of try to give you an idea of what you should be looking for in gear. So this first video, I'm going to go over dex, and I'll go over elite damage as well as fire damage. And my next one, I'll do critical hit damage and critical hit chance. And my last one, I'll do attack per second or attack speed versus average damage, because those two are a couple of the stats that people struggle with on getting or deciding between. So this first video, dex and other straight multiplicative effects. So the first thing I want to say is, in Diablo, almost everything on your damage sheet is a multiplicative effect. And this is what that means. Let's say you find an item, like my Eye of Etlich, that has 17% fire damage. What that actually does is it takes your damage and multiplies it by that 1.17. You don't see that in the sheet, but that is how the game would determine, or that's how Diablo Progress determines how much damage do you do against people with fire attacks. Now, there's some things that obviously aren't taken into account with that, and that's things like cooldown reduction and resource cost reduction. The game and Diablo Progress, I can't imagine a great way of it trying to tell you what your DPS is based on those things, so that's kind of up to you. But as far as most things that actually affect your sheet DPS are concerned, or that you should be concerned about on Diablo Progress, are multiplicative effects. So that brings me to kind of my first point about dexterity, strength, and intellect. When you're playing and you're trying to gear, dexterity, strength, and intellect work in the same way for their, the specific character that you're on. So Demon Hunters and Monk, dexterity; Crusader, Barbarian, strength; and then Wizard and Witch Doctor obviously use intellect. So dexterity is 1% damage increase per point. But this is the important thing you have to remember. I have a friend who complains about having a level 60 Stone of Jordan. His Stone of Jordan is literally my Stone of Jordan. Yeah, that maximum spirit's kind of bad, but it's literally my Stone of Jordan with 200 less dexterity, but he complains about this nonstop. If I lost my Stone of Jordan and had to use his, my damage would go down by literally 2%. You get to a point with dexterity, intellect, and strength where they don't actually add that much. They add, but it's to a less degree. There aren't diminishing returns, but there's a diminishing effect. You don't all of a sudden start gaining less damage because you have more dex. You start gaining less damage because you have the dex. So when you have 0 dexterity, strength, or intellect, that first 100 you add doubles your damage. The next 100, 50% more. The next 100, 25%. The next 100, 12.5%. Until you get to the point where a dex is just a straight trade for 1%. And then you'll get to the point after that where 400 dex is no longer 4%, but it's actually something like 3.5%, because you've stopped gaining a full, you've stopped seeing that effect, because no longer does 100% dex give you twice the damage. Now it gives you whatever you had times 1.1. So that's kind of how dexterity, intellect, and strength in a nutshell should be looked at. If you have a lot, that's when you start looking at, hey, maybe I should sacrifice some in place of other stats that have multiplicative effects that haven't been abused as much as I have with stacking dexterity. Now, elite damage works in the same way fire damage does, and that's why I decided I'll just go over those real quick. Elite damage takes your damage and multiplies it by your bonus damage to elites. So to get your overall damage right here for me, it would take the sheet damage and it would multiply it by 1.71 and by 1.41. And as long as you pass second grade math, you know that either way you do it, it comes out to be the same number. And that's essentially the damage that Diablo Progress tells you when you look on that site. So, as kind of a few final thoughts here, when you're pretty geared, dexterity becomes, or strength or intellect, becomes your kind of bottom choice. Like, crit chance or dexterity, definitely crit chance. But dexterity or average damage or dexterity or attack speed, those you could potentially think about. To the effect, I put top priority on elemental damage. I will lose anytime 10% damage on my sheet if I got 15 to 20% damage from an item. And to that effect, depending on what you're losing, let's say you're losing critical hit chance minus 15% from your sheet, that you are truly losing 15% sheet damage. But when you add back the 15% from fire skills, that 15% is multiplied by your overall. That could still be more damage, and individually you will hit for more depending on, you know, what skills you're using. Obviously, as long as you use fire, individually those hit harder than if you lose that crit chance. And that's why I say fire or elemental damage in general is kind of your first option for, hey, what do I want to stack? Then after that is when you start looking at other options. So now I'm going to talk about critical hit damage and critical hit chance in my next video, and then like I said, I'll end with average damage and attack speed. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask me, and I will see you guys on the next video.